So hello and welcome to yet another video on reproductive pathology, and today we are going to discuss something that is known as endometriosis, right? So what is endometriosis? Before we deal in about endometriosis, first we will have to learn something about the endometrium, right? So what is endometrium? As you know that the uterus has different layers, like the outermost this layer is known as the endometrium, and the muscular layer of the uterus is known as the myometrium, right? So the muscular layer is known as the myometrium, and the outer epithelial layer, that is known as the endometrium. This endometrium is supplied by blood vessels. You all know that this endometrium is very rich in blood vessels. That is why this is the layer that sheds during menstruation. So the bleeding that comes during menstruation is due to the rupture of the endometrial blood vessels. Now, what does this endometrium contains? So what this endometrium is endometrial tissue, right? This endometrial tissue consists of two things, right? One is the stroma and another is the glands. If you're not understanding what I'm telling, I'll show you a picture. This is the endometrial tissue. This is the endometrial tissue, right? So this endometrial tissue, it consists of two parts. One is the stroma and the glands. This is the gland, endometrial gland, and this is known as the stroma. So this much you have to know, that this is the stroma and this is the glands that is present in the endometrium. So whenever you are talking about endometrium, one thing that should be in your mind is that endometrium is a tissue. It consists of stroma, it consists of glands. Now we are going to go into the pathology of the endometrium. One of the important pathology is the endometrosis. So what exactly is endometrosis? And endometrosis is the presence of endometrium in any other location other than the uterus. This tissue endometrium is present in the uterus, right? But if this endometrium happens to be present in any other location other than the uterus, that means if it is present at an ectopic site, this ectopic site maybe it is present in the ovary. The endometrium layer is present in the ovary, or the endometrium layer is present in the intestine. If it is present in the colon, this is known as endometrosis. So endometrosis is the presence of endometrial tissue. Endometrial tissue means endometrial glands, endometrial stroma in any other abnormal location outside the uterus. That is known as endometrosis. So we'll go on to the definition. So if you look at the definition, you can see that presence of ectopic endometrial tissue at a site outside the uterus, right? So the endometrial tissue is present at some ectopic sites. This ectopic site is outside the uterus. So as you know that endometrium means it consists of stroma and it consists of glands. So you already know it, right? Now if I talk about the definition in detail, so you can see here in the slide, endometrosis, it is the presence of endometrial tissue outside the uterus. Endometrial tissue means endometrial stroma, endometrial gland. What are the sites, okay, where endometrosis can occur, where endometrial glands can be present? So ovary is the most common site of endometrosis. Endometrial tissue may be present in the broad ligament, in rectovaginal septum, cul-de-sac, pouch of Douglas, even in the lungs and even in the intestine. If you look here, the sites, right? So generally the endometrial glands, the endometrial tissue is present in the endometrium. But if it is present at any other site other than the uterus, for example, it is present in the colon, it is present in the pouch of Douglas, if it is present in the fallopian tube, if it is present in the ovary, right? Ovary is the most common site. So this is known as the endometrosis. So one of the most important things is that you know that during menstruation, the endometrial tissue that is present in the uterus generally ruptures and it causes bleeding. But what if the endometrial glands are present in the ovary? What if in endometrosis will there be bleeding? The answer is yes. So during menstrual cycle, even these tissues that are present in the ovary, even these tissues are going to bleed. So what will happen if they bleed? So there will be a lot of blood that is present in the ovary, right? So there will be a lot of blood that is present, there will be present in the ovary. So this is one of the very important things that we're going to discuss slowly, right? So remember that endometrial glands, these are functional and hence they will bleed during menstruation. So if the endometrosis is present in the ovary, so even in the ovary it is going to bleed, and hence the ovary will be filled with blood, and such a ovary we call it chocolate cyst ovary. Chocolate cyst, right? We call it chocolate cyst because you know blood will get accumulated in the ovary, and when this blood is going to get old blood will be brown in color, right? So old blood will be brown in color. So if the old blood is brown in color, then that will look like a chocolate, so we'll call it chocolate cyst. We'll discuss about it later. Okay, now we are talking about the clinical feature. How does a patient with endometriosis present? So there is a classical triad of pelvic pain, dysmenorrhea, and dyspareunia. So this is the classical triad that is seen in the patient: the pelvic pain, dysmenorrhea, and dyspareunia. This means pain during intercourse, and even infertility is also seen in a lot of women. So in a lot of women, even infertility is seen, right? So infertility is also seen in a lot of women. Now, if you ask me the occurrence, so in what age group is it seen? So it is generally seen in second to third decade of life. Second to third decade of life means the women that are in reproductive age group. So it is very common in women in reproductive age group, and it is even common in premenstrual females. So those females that are not yet stepped into menstruation, even these women show endometriosis. Now, if you talk about the pathogenesis, right? Now, what is the pathogenesis of endometriosis? So now I'll explain to you over here. Pathogenesis of endometriosis. Pathogenesis means how endometriosis is caused. So there are different hypotheses. Okay, so there are different hypotheses that tries to explain how the endometriosis occurs. So the first hypothesis is known as regurgitation theory. Regurgitation theory. This regurgitation theory means retrograde menstrual theory. Retrograde menstruation theory. This is also known as Samson's theory. Now, what this theory says, I'm going to explain to you in short. So, as you know that during menstruation, what happens? The endometrial tissue is going to shed, and generally it comes out this way, right? Right. This is the normal way how menstruation occurs. Endometrial glands they shed, and it comes out this way through the vagina, through the cervix, right? But according to this theory, during menstruation, instead of the tissue coming this way, this tissue moves in a retrograde manner. So it will move into the fallopian tube, and through that it is going to go into the ovary. So the endometrial tissue, it goes to ovary in a retrograde manner. In a retrograde manner. So due to this, the endometrial glands are now present in the ovary, and this is the cause of endometriosis. This theory is telling this. Okay, so this says that basically menstruation occurs in the opposite direction, and in this way the endometriosis occurs in the ovary. Now this is true for a lot of cases because the most common site for occurrence of endometriosis is ovary. However, this has a lot of limitations, right? And one of the main limitations is that, okay, understood that by retrograde method it is going into the ovary, but can you please explain me how it is going to the lungs? How has the endometrial tissue migrated to the lungs? So this theory is not able to explain the migration of endometrial tissue in the lungs. This theory is not able to explain how the endometrial tissue are present in the lungs. So its limitation is, presence of endometrial tissue in lungs. It is not explained by this theory. Similarly, I've told you that endometriosis, it occurs in premenstrual female as well. That means it can occur in female who have not yet went into menstruation. So if the female has not yet gone into menstruation, if menstruation has not occurred yet, then how can the endometrium go? How can retrograde menstruation occur, right? So if menstruation hasn't occurred, how can retrograde menstruation occur? So this does not explain endometriosis in premenstrual female. So these are the two limitations of Samson's theory. Now, what are the other theories? So we have discussed the first theory, regurgitation theory. Regurgitation theory is actually the most favored theory. It says that due to retrograde menstruation, there is going to be implantation of the endometrial tissue in the ovary. Now, the second theory is the benign metastasis theory. Second theory is the benign metastasis theory. So according to the benign metastasis theory, the endometrial tissue, right? The endometrial tissue is going to get metastasized, right? It is going to undergo metastasis, right? Metastasis. What is the meaning of metastasis? Metastasis means spreading of a certain cell line to a distant organ by the help of blood, lymphatics. So this benign metastasis theory, what does it say? It says that the endometrial tissue via blood vessels and lymphatics. It is going to go into the distant sites like the lungs, etc., and in this way it is going to cause endometriosis. So it is saying that endometriosis occurs when the endometrial tissue, that is endometrial glands, endometrial stroma, these enter the blood vessels, lymphatics, and it is going to go into the ectopic site. The third theory is known as the metaplastic theory. According to metaplastic theory, during development, the coelomic epithelium of the abdomen, okay, the coelomic epithelium of the abdomen that we call as mesothelium of pelvis and abdomen, this is going to undergo metaplasia. It is going to undergo metaplastic change, and this is going to get converted into endometrium, right? So basically, if you're not understanding what I'm talking, then please remember that I'm explaining how endometriosis occurs. Okay, so basically the first theory was regurgitation theory. This theory could explain how, the tissue is going into the ovary. However, we are not still understanding how the endometrial tissue is formed in the lungs. Okay, so we are trying to understand how the endometrial tissue is found in the lungs. So the second theory says that in the lungs, endometrial tissue is present in the lungs because the endometrial tissue via blood vessels and lymphatics, it is going to go into the distant sites. So it is saying that the endometrial tissue occurs, it is present in the lungs because it has metastasized from somewhere. The third theory says that actually the mesothelium or the coelomic epithelium that forms the lungs, okay, that has undergone metaplastic changes into the endothelium. So in this way it is being formed. Okay, so instead of forming the lining of lungs, it is forming endometrium, right? The fourth theory is known as the extrauterine stem or progenitor cell theory. You can just remember it as stem cell theory. So according to the stem cell theory, the stem cells of bone marrow, these are going to get differentiated into the endometrium. So basically this theory says that the stem cells of bone marrow, these differentiate into the endometrium. So this much you have to know the pathogenesis, right? The four theories. Now if we discuss it from the slide, remember here four major theories for development of endometriosis. The first one is this one, the regurgitation theory, that is known as the retrograde menstruation theory. Retrograde menstruation through the fallopian tube could mediate spread of endometrial tissue to the peritoneal cavity or other ectopic sites, basically the ovary. The second is benign metastasis theory. So according to this theory, endometrial tissue from the uterus can spread to distant sites via blood vessels and lymphatics. So in this way it is going to the lungs, right? It is going to the brain. The third theory is known as metaplastic theory. This says that endometrium arose directly from coelomic epithelium. Okay, so it arose from the coelomic epithelium, that is mesothelium of pelvis or abdomen. It arose from the tissue that forms the lining of lungs. Okay, so lining of pelvis, lining of abdomen. So they underwent metaplastic changes, right? So instead of forming lining of pelvis, they formed endometrial tissue. Fourth is the stem cell theory, that says that the stem cells of bone marrow, they gave rise to endometrium. So this much is all about the pathogenesis. So remember the gross appearance. For example, if this is the ovary that is undergoing endometriosis, so here there are presence of endometrial tissue. Now what will happen? These endometrial tissue, as I have already told you, these endometrial tissue, these are responsive to different hormonal changes. These are functional endometrial tissue. So during menstruation, these tissue are going to bleed, right? So remember, in gross features, these endometrial tissue that are present in the ovary, these are functional, right? So these respond to different hormonal stimulation, and that is why they bleed. So when they bleed, when they bleed, right, when they rupture, they are going to form nodules. They are going to form red, blue to yellow brown nodules. Now when these cysts are going to bleed, remember that when these cysts are going to bleed, they are going to release a lot of blood in the ovary, right? So they are going to release a lot of blood into the ovary. Now when they release a lot of blood into the ovary, these blood, you know that the blood contains hemosiderin pigment. So hemosiderin pigment will also get released. Now this blood, okay, when it gets old, it is going to change into brown color. Okay, it is going to change into brown color. So this brown color gives the appearance of chocolate. So we say that chocolate cyst chocolate cyst ovary is present. Okay, so what is chocolate cyst ovary? Chocolate cyst ovary means that this ovary that is containing endometriosis, this ovary will contain various cystic masses, okay, containing a brown fluid, containing brown fluid. What is this brown fluid? This brown fluid is actually the old blood that is formed by the hemorrhage, right? So chocolate cyst ovary, this is another gross feature. And remember that there is going to be widespread fibrosis. Now if you ask me what is the reason of fibrosis, you know that blood is released. So if there is a release of blood, there is going to be fibrous tissue as well, right? So clotting, clotting will try to occur. So there is going to be widespread fibrosis. Okay, fibrosis and adhesion will occur due to extensive hemorrhage. So there is going to be fibrosis. So remember these three gross features. Okay, so if I look at the slide, what is given here? So remember, there are nodules with red, blue to yellow brown appearance just beneath the site of involvement. The foci are surrounded by fibrous tissue and adhesions. Remember this. And ovary has uh, large cystic mass with brown fluid due to hemorrhage, right? That is ovary filled by blood, filled by old blood. This is known as chocolate cyst. Chocolate cyst ovary. This is very important. Write this point in the exam. Okay, now if we talk about the microscopy, I've already explained to you about the microscopy. Microscopy is basically simple. I've already told you what will this ovary contain. This ovary is containing endometrial tissue, right? Endometrial tissue it is containing. Endometrial tissue means there is going to be presence of stroma. There is going to be presence of stroma, and there is going to be presence of glands. So endometrial glands is present, endometrial stroma is present, and alongside this there is going to be hemorrhage. If there is hemorrhage, there is going to be release of blood, and blood contains which pigment? Hemosiderin. So it is going to contain hemosiderin pigment. These are the three microscopic features which you have to remember. So it is very easy. So microscopic feature ma, you will see endometrial tissue. Endometrial tissue means endometrial glands, endometrial stroma. There is going to be hemorrhage. If there is hemorrhage, there is going to be release of blood. Blood contains which pigment? Hemosiderin. So hemosiderin will be seen. And these hemosiderin, these hemosiderin will get engulfed by the macrophages. So this hemosiderin pigment, it is generally engulfed by the macrophages. So we can say hemosiderin laden macrophages, right? So you understand what is the meaning of hemosiderin laden macrophages, right? So there is even going to be zone of inflammation, and fibrosis is also seen. So this is all about